Well, good evening. I've always been slightly dubious about people with high intelligence when I go to university, and this just proves me correct. I mean, they can't work the bloody computer. Are there any mechanics in the room? Any racing mechanics in the room? Because that would be fixed like that. The business of sport. It's one of the best educators you could ever have, is sport. Because when you find a sport that you're good at, you commit yourself so completely because you're there to be beaten by everybody else, whether it's an individual sport or whether it's a team sport. And the aggravation of losing is not a comfortable one. So you always want to win. Whether it's a young man or a young woman, I think sport's one of the greatest developers of people. You can go on to do other things, but it's a fantastic introduction to being able to learn how to win, how to beat other people, how to be the best. In my particular case, it was a real problem. I'm a severe dyslexic. A really bad dyslexic. I can't read or write properly. If you gave me $1 million right now, and I know that's not much for university people, but if you gave me $1 million right now, I could not recite the alphabet. I've never been able to learn it. I don't know the words of the Lord's Prayer. I said them every single day at primary school and secondary school, and I still can't do it. I was a millisecond behind everybody else. I don't know the words of the national anthem. I've stood beside the Queen quite often, humming, because I can't recite the words of the national anthem. It just doesn't work in here. That computer, I could never work. I don't have an iPhone, I don't have an iPod, I can't send emails because I can't find my name on a keyboard. I can't find Jackie Stewart on a keyboard. I'm just blind when it comes to things like that. And when I was at school, I was a complete disaster. I never went through my qualifying. It was 11 plus in those days. I was knocked back 3 times and never did pass it. So I ended up, in those days at school, if you were really clever, you got Latin and French in Scotland. And if you were kind of half clever, you got French. If you were not very bright at all, you got woodwork. And if you were really dumb, you got woodwork and metalwork. And that's what I did. I got metalwork and woodwork, and I left at the age of 15 without any education. So here am I, and that's one of the reasons I'm here. I've spoken here before, and I've spoken at Cambridge, because I love speaking to young people. I've spoken to a lot of universities in America, and some in this country too. But when you see all these wonderful books and these wonderful rooms that have all been built on education, then for me, that was such a blind part of my life. So therefore, if that's the case, and you can't do the things other people can do so easily, you're isolated. In my case, it started at primary school, because you can't read in front of a group this size. My class in primary school was 54 people. Now the number has been for many years that out of 10, there will be probably 4 or 5 dyslexics, 4 usually. And there's usually more dyslexic boys than there are dyslexic girls, ironically. In that case, it moves from the time I was asked to read something out of an SE book. The teacher would pull me up and say, "You read this." I couldn't read it. It was just a jungle in front of me. And of course, you all start to cough and snigger and laugh. It's not a very nice feeling for a kid of 9, 10, or 11 years of age. And then it moves from the classroom to the playground, because the clever folk never want to talk to the dummies. So in my particular case, I probably had 3 or 4 or 5 actually, young ones that were the same age as I was, and sometimes the others was younger because they had come on faster. There would be we at one end of the playground, and the clever ones are at the other end. So you start under these circumstances to want to do something really well. Both my sons have got dyslexia, not as far as I am perhaps in it. Paul's lighter than Mark. But when you're dyslexic, when you find something you're good at, whew, boy, do you work at it. In my particular case, it was shooting. My grandfather was a gamekeeper. So I grew up shooting rabbits and pigeons when I was from about 12 or 14 years of age. By 14, I started to shoot competitively. For the first time in my life, I was good at something. And suddenly, in my very first competition, after my dad had thrown hand clay pigeons up into the air, bang, I would break them. I went to my first competition at the age of 14 and won it. Why? It was in Scotland on New Year's Day. All the competitors were pissed. So Jackie won. But what a big deal that was. The trophy must have been that big, and I won it 3 years back to back, and New Year's Day every time. But it meant that it gave me something that I was good at. Then do you focus. So you focus on something, and I got a hold of it. So I went on to shoot for Scotland, and then I went on to shoot for Great Britain from the age of 14 until I was 23. So I shot all around the World Championships, the European Championships, the Mediterranean Championships. Fantastic. And I was a mechanic in the garage because I left school at 15. I tried night school, that didn't work very well either. So I was good with my hands, good at taking gearboxes apart and putting them together again and doing all of these things. But my shooting was my whole life. Until I was 23 when I got married to Helen. And I found out that shooting is an amateur sport and it costs quite a lot of money. By then I was getting all my cartridges for nothing and I was getting my guns for nothing, but you still had a lot of travel and costs. And I found out that some of you will find out, and it's a tough one to take on, that marriage is also expensive, and so was shooting. So I couldn't afford marriage and shooting. And as you fellas will soon understand, wives are very expensive to have around. Doesn't work well in mixed audiences, and my son always starts doing that when I mention that. But that was one of the reasons I had to stop shooting, honest to God. But I was a mechanic, and there was a very rich young man in Glasgow. And his family, he was only son, and his family would not, the family trust would not allow him to race. But he was rich enough to enjoy the privilege of having really nice cars. So he had them looked after in our garage. My father had a wee garage outside of Glasgow. So anyway, I was the mechanic. As a reward at the end of the day, he said, why don't you do a little race? I did one and I finished second. And he said, oh, well, you better do another one. I won that. And it was like a rocket ship took off. Because from my shooting, which I had absolute, I mean, I still shoot, but that was the biggest thing in my life. And suddenly, to drive a racing car, which I'd never done, and it was only in Scotland, small events, but I started to win. And there was a team called the Écurie Écosse, Scottish team. And they had won Le Mans a couple of times. They had all the good drivers that you could get to drive their cars. And a man called David Murray, who was the chef of Écurie Écosse, he invited me to drive. And I drove for him. That was a big deal. My contract was £500 and I had to pay my own expenses. But I got 50% of the prize money and 50% of the bonus money. And that was 1963, a long time ago, before you were all born. But for me, it was a beginning. And I was able to afford some of the things that I would not normally been able to afford. By 1964, I was earning about £10,000 a year then. And that's quite a lot of money in those days. We had a wee bungalow. To give you an idea, our house cost £3,000. And it was a really nice house. Suddenly the whole world changed for me. Because in that year I went to Monte Carlo. I won the Formula 3 race, my first race ever abroad. And that was the big deal. The first man to shake my hand was a man called Fangio, who is the greatest racing driver of all time, in my opinion. Now, that started off by the fact that I was able, because I had no money, I was able to do something that I was still working in the garage while still racing. So suddenly, because we had no money, either Helen or I, it meant that we were saving everything we could. So the business of sport didn't really happen there. But by the end of my first Formula 3 year, that was 1964, I was then invited by Lotus, by Cooper and by BRM to drive in Formula 1. That's when, if you like, the business of sport came in. Because my first retainer from BRM was £4,000. Sounds silly today when you think of what the boys are earning. But within 18 months, I was making £100,000. And what do you do with £100,000 when you've had no money? You hoard it. In Scotland, you put it in a wee box under the bed. And suddenly, I had to learn how to present myself, how to be a little better than the next person. I was driving under Graham Hill, who was the #1 driver. But Jim Clark had become a great friend. And he was the finest racing driver I've ever raced against. And I would only put him second to Fangio. But he was fantastic. A border farmer with incredible modesty, but amazing skill. And because we were both Scots and going to the same racetracks and everything, I was able to spend a huge amount of time with him. We shared an apartment in London. It was John Whitmore's, a man called Sir John Whitmore, who used to drive Lotus Cortinas and GT40s and things. He gave us the apartment to use for nothing. 2 Scotsmen in London getting an apartment for nothing. In Mayfair, no, I mean, really first class. By then, I was beginning to say, well, why is he getting more than I'm getting? And how do I manage to do that? I got a contract with the Ford Motor Company in 1964. The contract was £500 and a Ford Zodiac. Some people would pay not to have a Ford Zodiac at that. But I had a Ford Zodiac. And suddenly, the PR man at Ford Motor Company started to use Jim Clark and Jackie Stewart and Graham Hill. Suddenly, I had to learn how to speak in front of people. I had to learn what to dress in front of people. Graham Hill dressed immaculately. I thought, oh, if he dresses, I better get a Savile Row suit as well. So I got a Savile Row suit, very expensive. But I had to have that if I was going to be with Dunlop, with the Ford Motor Company, and at that time Shell. So while you're growing up, and while you're looking for jobs, your presentation skills have got to be considerably better than what you think. And it's not that you've got to wear a tie, it's not that you've even got to wear a jacket, but it's got to be clean. It's got to be well pressed. And the shoes have got to be clean when you go in for the job, or when you go in to do an appearance, or you go in to do an interview. Your presentation has got to be considerably better than you might think it has to be. Perception is 9/10 of the law. If people think that you look right and you're going to do the thing correctly because you've behaved correctly or you've got the right manners, you're in a number 8 to a number 10 before you start. And somebody might be better at mathematics or at something else, but if they don't impress 2 or 3 people that are in the room that you want to get the job in, then how you present yourself and how you address them and how you speak to them and how you communicate to them is far more important than you really realize. And most young people, and I say young people, and that comes right after university time, don't do it very well in a lot of cases. So don't underestimate that. The impression that you give to people is more important than you'll ever realize. And as I say, perception is 9/10 of the law. Of course you can have the academics to go with it. Of course you can have a few good references. But if they don't like the look, or they have a question, or you've got your head down all the time and you don't present yourself well, the other person will get the job, man or woman. And it doesn't matter how high you get up in the business. By the time I had well retired, I was starting a company because Paul and I had something called Paul Stewart Racing. And that was for a staircase of talent for young racing drivers to come along. They were coming out of Formula Ford, and we were bringing them into single-seaters at Formula Opel Series and Formula Vauxhall in this country and Formula 3 up to Formula 3000. We taught all our drivers. We sent them to public speaking courses, and we got them dressed. Because we had a whole bunch of sponsors. There's a young lady in this audience whose grandfather sponsored Paul Stewart Racing. He owned QuickFit, one of the best companies in the United Kingdom, and sold it for one of the biggest prices in the United Kingdom I had ever seen. But we had QuickFit as a sponsor. But we had some great names, Walker's Shortbread, a lot of Scottish companies. But they all wanted something back, not just on the track, but to invite guests coming along, because corporate hospitality in motorsport is probably bigger than any other sport. So we taught our drivers public speaking course. Not just for speaking for a group of people like you, but for television, which is totally different. Different skill to talk to television with nobody looking at you. You've got to get your points across the right way in a polished fashion. So whether it was radio, print, or television, they were taught how to do it. And they were pretty impressive people. David Coulthard, Alan McNish, Barrichello, Castro Neves, Montoya, Gilles de Ferran, a whole bunch of very big names that developed. David Coulthard now is as good a commentator and as a presenter in motorsport as you will find. And so is Alan McNish, by the way. So they were all taught by Paul Stewart Racing. But there were a company called Kingstree did the teaching. And we had a lot of our staff, one of them are here tonight, would go to Kingstree, because if they're marketing and selling sponsorship, they've got to know how to do it. And if you're a great chemist or a great technician or a great scientist of any kind, in any area that you're involved in, there will be a time that you will present your new concept that's going to be an improvement to anything else they've ever seen before. And however good it is, if you poorly present it, you get it lost. If you present it very well and you know how to speak well and you deliver yourself well, the chance of you getting it done is considerably better. So those little snippets that they had when they went along, when you're dealing with big multinationals, I'm with Rolex. I've been with Rolex for 47 years. That's a long contract. I was the first person to spray champagne in Formula One. In 1969, that was French Grand Prix, Clermont-Ferrand. Won the race. The idiot, the organizer of the race, there was a podium, and they put this double magnum of champagne on the podium before the race. It was 82 degrees of heat. And we had, in those days, races were longer. It might have been 2 hours, 40 minutes, 2 hours, 20 minutes, 2.5 hours. I win the race. Mitterrand was there and presented me with this beautiful trophy, of which I still got, one of the few. And he said, in broken English, you should put the champagne in the trophy so we can celebrate your victory. Of course, I said, of course. I get it. I take the top off, you know, the gold bit in the top, and then I undid the wire, and I just got to the last thing, and the thing exploded and went higher than these lights there on its own. Being Scottish, naturally, champagne's expensive, you wouldn't want to waste it, so you put your thumb on it. From here, it went over to the back of the room. I mean, it just went amazing. So I was the first person ever to do that. And the harder I pressed my thumb, the further it went. And then you get the idea, there's some photographer that you know and you, oops, you could, I mean, at the end of my career, I could hit somebody at 20 meters easily. and the camera lens is ruined and the whole shebang, but great to do. I've been with Morton Shandong since 1969. That's 46 years. To be 46 or 47 years with a company, you've got to deliver. You've got to over-deliver. If you under-deliver, there's somebody else. So it never stops. So you learn more. It's like me buying the Savile Row suit. Went to Kilgar, French and Stanbury because Graham Hill went to Kilgar, French and Stanbury in Savile Row. Got this lovely suit. Boy, did I look good, says I. Because racing drivers, the girls will be pleased to hear, are usually got very good physiques. Because they've got to be fit, even in those days. Not as fit as they are now, but pretty fit. So I think I'm now going to win the world. I've got a Savile Row suit. I'm thinking, okay. Then I find out racing drivers have pretty thick necks because the helmets, the head's about 14 pounds, your head. Most people's head. Scholastics, about 8 pounds. But 14 pounds is the head. The helmet's about 6 pounds in those days. So that's 20 pounds. So we don't do what they do now. They're up to 5 Gs now. So your neck muscles, even in those days, were bigger than most other people. So of course, I've now got a Savile suit. I'll go into, what's the one in German Street? Turnbull and Nassau. I thought that's the best place to go. I got a shirt in Turnbull and Nassau. To get my shirt the right size round the neck, you know, the cuffs were down here beyond my fingers. So I bought it off the peg. So when I got home and I'm getting this thing on, of course, here I am. I had to have all that shortened. And then I think I'm really well dressed because I had a tie. That was okay. And I could tie a tie. Barrichello couldn't tie a tie. Magnussen couldn't do a tie. None of them, hardly any of the Continentals, Castroneves and Montoya, couldn't tie a tie. So we taught them that was one of the big issues, getting them to learn how to tie a tie. Not all that easy when you're 18 or 19 or 20 years of age. So here was I with this good tie, good shirt, and then I looked at my shoes. The shoes were a disaster. They were hush puppies, actually. And I thought they were the best things in town at the time. So I had to have a pair of shoes made. Then I was complete. Now, I tell you that for a different reason. Because we dressed all of those drivers the same way. They had Dougie Hayward suits. Same guy has made this suit. Hang on. This was done in 1989, this jacket. So I got Doug Hayward to make a suit, a blazer, 2 pairs of trousers with the suit. And we got them shoes, and we got them shirts made because they had to fit them, because they got good physiques, and give them a tie. And we had to not only give them shoes, but we had to give them socks, because they would have worn white socks. So they had to have the whole thing. But think about it. When I was doing that, not just in Paul Stewart Racing, but in Formula One, we had Hewlett-Packard, we had HSBC, we had Texaco, we had Lear Corporation. They do the interiors of all cars. Who else did they have, Paul? We had the government of Malaysia and a few others. Yeah. Hugo Boss. Yeah, Hugo Boss. We had everybody, real good sponsors. When you bring your drivers to a boardroom or a presentation, the chairman would come out, and the chairman's usually very fat, and his jacket never meets, and he's usually looks like he's been hit by a bus. When he went out and did that, and all the board are there at these big meetings, and a lot of their major customers, we would come out and have our drivers present to all of these people. It wouldn't be good enough for me to do it because they want to see the people who are doing it now. And these guys came out like wedges, beautifully dressed, trousers done properly, everything right. the impression that that gave when it came to renewing a contract made a big difference. It's a whole package that comes together. And whether it's Williams today or whether it's McLaren or Mercedes or Ferrari, I'm still amazed that Vettel arrives at a Grand Prix circuit dressed like somebody's hit him with a bus. I mean, he's got filthy sneakers on, he's got a pair of shorts that have been on for a month and certainly haven't been at the cleaners, and it's a t-shirt. Now, that's okay for doing other things, but the guy's probably paid conservatively 35 million? 35 million pounds. And all of these big sponsors are on the car. And the Shell Oil Company are with Ferrari. And they're a pretty conservative bunch of people at Shell. And so also are the other multinational corporations that are involved. They like to see people properly presented, even if they're off duty, walking into the track before they get into their overalls, because when they get into their overalls, they look dynamite. But beforehand, they're not. But that's the same day as you're racing. That's your work day, whether it's testing or whether it's racing. So presentation skills are more important than you all think when it comes to getting the job or getting up in the company. The other thing is that when you're doing that, you're in competition with other people. Just as a racing driver's in competition on the track, you will all be in competition with other people, whatever you choose to do, whatever arena that you choose to be in. And no matter how good you're at what you do, again, you're going to be having a perception factor somewhere along the line. And if you present, I don't mean to say you've got to wear a collar and tie and a jacket all day long, but what you're wearing has to look good. You'd be surprised how important it is. So don't think that just because you're a genius, you're going to get it easily. If you're going to go in, if you're driving for Mercedes-Benz or you're the chief engineer or a mechanic and you've got the chairman of the board coming to see your race, that's why all these mechanics are immaculate. Whatever the Formula One team exists, to the smallest and least successful one at the present time, they're all well presented. They've all got clean overalls on all the time. They're not overalls, they're racing suits. But they're immaculate. They're doing pit stops, but they're always changed. The laundry bill is considerable, but they've got to look tidy. They've got to look clean. And that's one of the most impressive things. If I take the chairman of the board of a major multinational corporation to come in and try and get them into Formula One today, one of the things I'll do for sure is to take them into the garage. The garage is immaculate. There's not a mark on the floor. Some idiot driver takes it off too quickly and there's rubber all the way up to the end of the garage that they're in. Immediately that happens, there's a guy down there wiping off the rubber. It's immaculate. And they are immaculate. And as soon as the car comes in, the moment it comes in, everybody's taking little bits off the front, off the back, clean as a whistle. So that's what happens. You've got to present yourself all of the time at the highest level. You'll keep your sponsorship in the case of a racing team, and you'll keep your job. Now, a lot of people are frightened from somebody who they think is better or could be better than them, and therefore they'll sideline them. They'll try and sideline them. And you might be that person who's good. Don't sideline them. If they're good, give them a kiss every morning, because if they're going to be working with you, your department or your operation is going to be better because you've got the best people with you. My engineers and my mechanics that I had were better at what they did than I ever was at what I did. I could give you the name of my mechanics like that because they were so important. I had the best mechanics and engineers. I didn't win all that many Grand Prix because there weren't that many at that time. I did 99 races. I won 27 of them. And I cannot tell you how many podiums I've had. I just don't know, because it doesn't matter. It only matters how many you've won. So I won 27 out of the 99. Quite a good batting average. Because to finish first you must finish. I didn't have wheels fall off. I didn't have too many transmission failures. I didn't have too many things that broke down. So therefore I finished a lot of races. And therefore I managed to win a few. So the people who were surrounding me, in my opinion, were better at what they did than I was at what I did. So never think you're going to be threatened by somebody who's good, as long as you have them on board with you and you service them. Because that means that your department's going to run better. I put a list together of some of the things that I think you might be interested in. Being dyslexic, the one very good thing I'm at is attention to detail. If you get attention to detail, you'll be amazed at how many things come right. So it doesn't matter, the menial task division is what I was involved in. If I hadn't won the World Championship driving racing cars, I guarantee you I would have won it cleaning windows. I don't like streaks in windows, because I've learned that you've got to do it right, whether it's a floor or a window or whether it's driving a racing car. So attention to detail is big time, much bigger than you think. Present yourself well, we've talked about that. Learn to communicate. A lot of very clever people are very poor communicators. They're thinking all the time, they're going to do their own business. If you're a better communicator than somebody else, and by the way, if you're an engineer or in any other industry, if you've got something that you've got that's really good, you've got to present it to senior management. And hopefully it's within budget. But even if it's outside of budget, if it's good enough and you present it well enough, they'll buy it. But if you don't present it well, it won't go above budget and they won't take it within budget. So how you present things are important. Learn to communicate. A lot of very clever people are not good communicators. Really learn how to communicate with everybody. Not just the rich one or not just the boss, all the way through. Good communication. Put more hours in than anybody else. You don't need to leave early. Put more hours in, people notice it. That's the guy, that's the girl, I'll have her or him. Keep them, because they see how hard you're working. You under-promise and you over-deliver. You never get the sack. Rolex. 47 years, 48 come April. I've worked hard for Rolex, but I still really work hard. And now I'm Arnold Palmer, myself, and a man called Jean-Claude Keely, who won 3 gold medals at the Olympics in '68. All 3 of us are still with Rolex. It's a record, I think. I don't think it exists in any other corporation in the world. But we've delivered. Arnold's still delivering, and he's now 85. He's still the most popular golfer in the world, actually. Ask for advice. I always had 2 people I always went to if I needed, am I right or am I wrong? I'm uptight, I can't decide, I've got to make a big decision. Always have somebody you can really trust, but they've got to be a lot better than you are. 2 people I started recognizing that was the King of Jordan, King Hussein, who was one of our best friends, godfather to Paul's first child. And the other one was Lord King of British Airways. I could phone up them at any hour and say, I've got a drama, what do you think? And sometimes they would agree with me, sometimes they wouldn't, but boy was it helpful to have somebody of that quality, and I still have somebody like that. Got 2 people that I can always go to. Somebody calls you, call them back, and call them back fast. All the really good people call back fast. Martin Sorrell's one of the busiest men in the world that I know, and one of the most successful in the world of advertising globally. The best guy to answer an email, the best guy to get a call back from. You always get it. And he's the top guy in the world, in my opinion, in his field. Choose people well who you hang out with. You show me somebody and I want to see their friends. If their friends are good quality, the chances are they're good quality. So you don't hang out with the wrong folk. If you're wrong, that broken nose didn't come from a big accident. I'd love to tell it was Monte Carlo and it was a huge accident. When I was 14 years of age, because of my dyslexia, I couldn't hang out with the clever folk. I hung out with a bunch that was in a Nissan hut. It was a billiard room up a close in Dumbarton. Came out one night, 5 of them kicked the living daylights out. 3 broken ribs, a broken collarbone and a broken nose. I was in the wrong place with the wrong people. Bingo. I never went there again. But if you can avoid that, it's a big advantage. So choose very carefully who you have. Choose the right people. And there are no free lunches. You've got to deliver. You've got to over-deliver. You can't just hang out there. You've got the job, good money, good time, leave early, etc. No free lunches. Find new ways of doing business. Some of you here are in research. Dyslexics are very good at finding new ways of doing business because they can't do the things that most people can do easily. So they go another route. They don't go down the M25. They go the rural route. It's quieter, less competition. Branson's dyslexic. Leonardo da Vinci was dyslexic. Einstein was dyslexic. Muhammad Ali was dyslexic. Is dyslexic. George Lucas is dyslexic. Who's the guy that did? Who's the other one? The film producer, film director.
Spielberg?
Huh?
Spielberg?
My son, other son. Much cleverer than this one. Anyway, George Lucas and these guys, all dyslexic. Who the hell would have thought about Star Wars? These wee things up in the sky. George Lucas did. And look at the success. Disney's dyslexic. Walt Disney was dyslexic. So find new ways of doing things. Do them differently than everybody else, because there are a whole lot of clever folk. If you go to Harvard right now, after you've done all your stuff here, and after you've started work for a company, there will only be about 6 or 8 of you in a class. You'll all come out the class with exactly the same route to travel. You travel the other way, you find new business. You find new ways of doing business. Never make decisions when you're under stress. Makes a big difference. When you've got your head together and you're cool, you're calm and you're collected, you will make a far better decision than when you are really under pressure. If you do nothing, nothing will happen. So you've got to move. You've got to see it coming, and you've got to be there before the problem shows itself, or at least becomes obvious that it's a disaster in the making. Because once the disaster starts, it's a bloody difficult job to stop it. It's like an avalanche sometimes. So if it's looking the bad side, find another way out, fix it, or tell everybody that this is not going to happen. But absolutely do something. Don't stand there and say it wasn't my fault. Everybody loves to have decisions made for them sometimes, and they certainly want to hear other people's opinion, particularly when they're up against a wall. So if you do those things, the chances are you're not going to go far wrong. And never be overconfident. You're all going to come out of this university, one of the finest universities in the world, and you can easily boast about it. And it'll certainly help you get a job, probably, because it's Oxford. So therefore, be avoiding the overconfidence factor. Just because you've gone through Oxford and you've done well and you've had great results, that ain't going to happen too well out in the big world outside there. You've got to deliver. So don't be overconfident about that, because somebody will trip you up. And finally, big trees blow over. It only depends on the strength of the wind. When that big wind came in 68, I think it was, 300-year-old oak trees planted all these years ago were blown over. Nobody thought they could ever be lost. Cromwell built them. He planted them. 300 years later, they're down because the wind was higher than it's ever been seen before at that time. So you're never safe. And it doesn't matter how big a reputation a company will have or an individual will have, they're only as good as what they deliver, and they've got to continue to deliver. And the company's got to succeed. Big companies fail. General Motors failed. Chrysler Corporation failed. A whole lot of big ones failed. Ford Motor Company didn't fail. They didn't go for government money. They had a very clever board, and they found other ways of doing the business, and they survived it. And now they're not paying back. They're now making profit. All that profit from the other two are going back to government. So therefore, it takes a lot of things to make things happen well. Sport, for me, has been a fantastic gymnasium. It's allowed me to do things and have access to some of the most powerful people in the world, because I happen to be a decent racing driver. And they like good sports people. But at the end of the day, you've still got to make them want to see you after you've won your world championship, and then the years after that. So whatever success you have can be very short-lived. The long-lived ones are the ones who have delivered for the longest period of time and done it better than anybody else. Everybody's still playing the Beatles because it was the best music of the time. So the really good bands are still out there. Some are older than me, and they're still playing because they're still good musicians. They've created good music, and they're still loved because they're actually delivering that type of quality. So it never stops. Do you think that thing's working now?
I'm afraid it isn't.
It isn't. Well, that's a shame, because I was going to end this up by saying, however good you think you've done something, there's always another wee bit you can do better. Just that extra yard. If you go that extra yard, even though you thought it was quite good, it just has polish on it. Paul, when I was 70 years of age, Paul, he plays the guitar. He learned the guitar from George Harrison. I mean, privileged child. But he learned to play the guitar. And when he had cancer, he learned to play the guitar even better because he had more time. So he decided he would write a piece of music for his father for his 70th birthday. And then he wrote the lyrics to go with it, and he put it together. Dear me, he sang it as well. And I had only heard him in the bathroom until then. But he did a good job. And it was really a good package. And when it was all finished, he thought, that's it, finished. And then he said, maybe I've just got to do a little bit extra to make it that little bit better. He said, how do I do that? Maybe I get another guitar player and just somebody, or a drummer or somebody, let me, one other musician just to help me along. And sure enough, he got one, and it did make a difference. I can't remember his name right now, but that extra step just made all the difference. Oh, hang on, I've got it. His name was Eric Clapton. So suddenly, something that was already good, and particularly good for Helen and I and the family, that he had created it. But suddenly Eric Clapton playing the guitar along with Paul and did a solo bit at the end, just changed the whole thing. So that was the extra yard. And everybody has an extra yard in there somewhere, for all of us, no matter what we do. So it's never as good as you think it is without the extra yard in most cases. So that's all I'm going to say, because you might have some questions, and you're going to try and help me. So if there are any questions, will you raise your hand? Since the high technology capital of the world, Oxford University, can't make the thing work. So therefore, he's going to stand up here, because my hearing's not too good. I did all that shooting and all that motor racing. That's this ear, and this ear is my wife ear. So they're totally deaf. So if I can't pick up what you're asking, young man here will translate for me. Are there any questions? And by the way, I judge the intelligence of the audience by the number of questions that we have.
Traditionally, motorsports has been seen as a sport for the domain of the rich. How do you make sure that motorsports is open to all people regardless of financial circumstance?
Good question. It was, in the old Brooklands days, big circuit at one point, the Bentley boys. The Bentley boys were all rich. They all did the Le Mans 24-hour race in their Bentley cars, and Rob Walker, Walker's Whiskey, used to change into a dinner jacket for the evening at the Le Mans 24-hour race. So they were all sort of eccentric and very rich. That's certainly not true of today, and it's not true for quite a long time. I personally had no money at all. Neither had Helen. I wish she had. I would love to have married a rich woman, but it didn't happen. So therefore, I made my way. And motor racing allowed me to do all the things that I've ever wished to do. There's nothing missing in my life at all. That's true of Nicky Lauda. That was true of James Hunt, his mum and dad. I mean, he went to a decent school. He went to Wellington, and therefore he was well educated, and he was slightly posh. But he was an exception. Most of the others certainly weren't. Jochen Rindt had no money. Most of the racing drivers, Graham Hill never had any money. Jim Clark didn't have money as such. They had farms and they had sheep, but they had no cash usually. So that's a generation that suddenly came about. And suddenly, because when you don't have any money, and sometimes you're surrounded by people who do have money, you try like hell to beat that bunch. So when I first went down south to race from Scotland, it was quite primitive in Scotland. When I went down south, everybody seemed richer than the Scottish guys with cars. They were always better dressed. They always had, cars were cleaner and tidier, and it was just a better package. It was, they were more advanced than we were up in Scotland. So I went down with an inferiority complex, like most Scots have an inferiority complex. They've got a chip in their shoulder. They think they're inferior because they're in a wee country up here and they're more sophisticated down south and so forth. And therefore, suddenly you got people coming into the sport that were sometimes mechanics, like I was, and for whatever reason, they tried that wee bit harder. When people have got a lot of money, they sometimes get a little bit laid back. And when mum and daddy give too much money to the younger ones, then they get the same problem. So if you've got to work for it, you usually try harder and you usually finesse it, you usually polish the nails a little bit better. So I think that's probably why that happened. Some of the greatest drivers in the world didn't have any money. Fangio had no money. Perron helped Fangio come to Europe when he was something like 39 years of age. He hadn't been in a Formula One car, and yet he won 5 world championships at that time because he was sent from little Argentina over to the might of Europe with all the fancy folk and Ferraris and Alfa Romeos and Maseratis and so forth. And he beat everybody because he was a hungry man. And Ayrton Senna's daddy was quite well off, but he was sent to Norfolk, to Snetterton, to Jim Russell's driving school. And he was living and sometimes sleeping in the back of a transit van because that's the way you were. Paul was doing the same with Paul Stewart Racing and before we created that. So when you're in that condition, you do try harder. So I think that's where the transmission changed and moved up a gear. So the money from a driver's point of view, there are some drivers come into Formula One with big packages that they've found in Brazil or somewhere else. Very seldom do they make the big time. Very, very seldom. Some people get picked up and come through but just beat everybody like Vettel did. Vettel didn't have any money. So Lewis Hamilton, his parents had no money. He was picked up by Ron Dennis and McLaren. He's a very lucky boy to where he sits today, and he'll probably earn 40 million a year now, and a lot more perhaps in the future. And if he were doing it really well commercially, I made far more money commercially than I ever did as a racing driver. And I'm making considerably more money now than I ever did when I was a racing driver, because I've serviced all these companies particularly well. So, but you've got to work hard to do it. I'm getting criticised by my sons, both of them, and my wife for working too hard. I'm 76 years of age. I love what I do. I don't want to stop it, but I want to deliver. And if I don't deliver, I won't get the relationships that I've got today. I work for UBS today. That's a brand new contract. It's only a year and a half old. And I get paid a lot of money by them. So you work harder when you don't have money, basically. So, but even the guys who have had a bit of money, if they're in there getting beaten up by everybody else, you raise your game. And that's a long answer to a short question. Anything else?
The hand on the aisle.
You mentioned James Hunt and Niki Lauda. Do you think that's probably one of the greatest sporting rivalries of all time?
I got the Niki Lauda bit. What was the other bit?
Can you repeat it one more time? So James Hunt.
James Hunt and Niki Lauda. Do you think that's one of the greatest sporting rivalries of all time?
No, I don't think so. I think Niki Lauda was a lot better than James Hunt. The McLaren at that time was a very good car. The Ferrari was a pretty good car, but I think Niki Lauda was a considerably better driver. He went on to win 3 World Championships. James was much better in the nightclubs than Niki Lauda ever was, and had considerably more success in other areas than Niki Lauda. Well, maybe not, but Niki Lauda was attracting girls much better after he got burned, because they were all sympathetic. But I keep telling everyone, when a whole lot of girls are around Niki Lauda to this day, they're all saying, well, Niki Lauda, and they want you. I said, listen, girls, settle down, all this bullshit. That ear didn't come off in the fire. Some girl bit it off. so, no, I think Niki was a superior driver. And James, when he won the World Championship, he got a lot of distractions, like some people do. And when you lose, when you do that, and the other guys, Lauda was focused all the time, and still is to this day, a very successful businessman.
What's your views on the difference in budgets between the top F1 teams and the teams that are lower down, and what impact do you think that has on the sport?
Good question again. There's always been big teams. There's always been teams with more money. At the present time, the differences are bigger. And when you think of Mercedes-Benz at the present time, they employ in the factory, somebody told me the other day it was in excess of 700 people now in the factory. And then they've got a wee engine shop next door. Now, can you imagine the Silver Arrows, giants of the 20s and 30s with Auto Union and Mercedes-Benz, then in the 50s with Fangio and Moss winning 2 World Championships back to back, and now here they are, the great German company. Cars made in Bicester in Buckinghamshire, and so is the engine. Britain, because our technology is better than in Germany or any other country. We're the capital for motorsport technology for the whole damn world. So the budgets have always been, Ferrari always had more than BRM, for example, or HWM before that, you know, in the years of Stirling Moss coming along, etc. The big teams, Maserati and Ferrari or Alfa Romeo, or when you got into it, the teams with money have always done well. There was a lovely period when everybody could buy a Lotus or a Cooper, and they could, in later years when I was doing it, they could buy a Cosworth engine, a Ford Cosworth engine. You could go in when it first began. Ken Tyrrell, who I drove for, after I won my first World Championship, Ken said, you know, we're going to make a statement for Cosworth. I'm going to put an advert in that says, if you go and buy a Cosworth engine, which in those days cost £7,500. That's what an engine cost. Formula One engine, way back in 71, 72. If you bought that and answered Ken's advert, he said that Jackie Stewart would drive it in the next Grand Prix. He was so confident that the Cosworth engine was so well created that there was no ups and downs. I think the biggest difference I ever heard of was 6 horsepower in a Cosworth engine. Now you're making engines that God knows what they cost. I don't think anybody does know what a Mercedes engine really costs. You know, the amount of money they've put into it, and Mercedes, because the Silver Arrows still want to win. So those budgets have gone way up. So has Red Bull, because Mateschitz could afford it. And it was exactly the right sport for them. So these budgets went up and went out of control. And the governing body have allowed that to happen. So there are ways of stopping it, but there's no way of stopping an Adrian Newey. But there was a John Barnard before Adrian Newey. There was, who was it was working with Frank? Patrick Head. These were geniuses at creating new gizmos within a Formula One racing car that showed an advantage. They came in with ground effects like nobody else ever had, Williams for a while. When Nigel Mansell was winning races with Piquet, that car, the Williams car, and we have Frank's son right here, was just blowing everybody away. And Colin Chapman for a while was doing the same with Jim Clark. These were not expensive cars, however, the Clark cars or the Cooper cars that Brabham was driving. So they've now gone over the top. And for Red Bull to have 680 people in the factory with somebody else's engine, I don't know, how many people do you have in the factory?
On Formula One, about 600.
600 people looking after 2 prima donna racing drivers. Basically. 4. I didn't know there were 4 prima donnas, but there are. So suddenly it's become unaffordable for an awful lot of people. The days of Ken Tyrrell are well over. And he won, can you imagine that Ken Tyrrell, we won the World Championship in the first full year that he ever entered a car in Formula One Grand Prix racing. We won the World Championship. The constructors, I mean, not just the drivers. And the car was built in a wooden hut in Ripley, Surrey. Literally a wooden hut. I don't know how many people he had, maybe 40, 45 people in total. And to come to a racetrack, we'd probably be 8 people, and that includes his wife, Nora, who made the sandwiches, and Ken Tyrrell himself. So it's changed. So I think it's gone over the top. How it's going to be equalised, I'm not quite sure, but it definitely needs to be changed because money still talks. Mercedes-Benz have done it for years, since the 20s and 50s, and now here. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is a problem. There is no doubt. And it's right now, the 2 drivers who are driving Mercedes-Benz right now have a huge advantage. It's not the same World Championship to win that as it was for Niki Lauda, for example, and James Hunt to be tying until the last race of the year. It was a whole different business. There was much more equality in those days. We need more equality. And we need more drivers who are really going to be outstanding to do that. And at the moment, if you don't have the right car, you're always more than 1.5 seconds slower than the Mercs right now. 1.5 seconds? I mean, if I had had 0.2 of a second advantage for pole position, I would have been more than pleased. So it's spoiling the spectators' pleasure, in my opinion, and that is important both for television and for the live audience. So it needs change.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. However, as is tradition, we'll be going through to the bar to continue the conversation. Would you please join me in thanking Sir Jackie Stewart?